Chapter 4 In the Dark. Where did he run to? But of course, where should she be if not with Fyodor Pavlovitch? She ran straight to him from Samsonov's. It's all clear now. The whole intrigue, the whole deception is obvious now. All this flew like a whirlwind through his head. He did not even run over to Maria Kondratovna's yacht. No need to go there. No need at all. Must not cause any alarm. They'll all play and betray at once. Maria is obviously in the conspiracy. Semedrikov too. They've all been bought. A different plan took shape in him. He ran down a lane, making a long detour around Fyodor Pavlovich's house, ran along Dmitrievsky Street, then ran across the footbridge and came straight to the solitary back lane. Empty and uninhabited, bordered on one side by the wattle fence of the neighbor's garden and on the other by the strong, high fence surrounding Fyodor's garden. There he chose a spot that seemed, according to the story he had heard, to be the same spot where stinking Lizaveta had once climbed over the fence. If she could climb over, the thought flashed, God knows why, through his head. Surely I can climb over too. He jumped and indeed managed at once to grasp the top of the fence with his hands. Then he pulled himself up energetically, climbed right to the top and sat astride the fence. There was a little bathhouse nearby in the garden, but from the fence the lighted windows of the house could also be seen. Just as I thought, there is a light in the old man's bedroom. She's there. And he jumped down from the fence into the garden. Though he knew that Grigory was sick and that Semedrikov perhaps was indeed sick as well, and that there was no one to hear him, he instinctively hid himself, stood stock still, and began listening. But there was dead silence and, as if on purpose, complete stillness. Not a breath of wind. And not but the silence whispers. The little verse, for some reason, flashed through his head. That is, if no one heard me jump over, and it seems no one did. Having paused for a minute, he quietly walked across the garden over the grass. He walked for a long time, skirting the trees and bushes, concealing each step, listening himself to each of his own steps. It took him about 5 minutes to reach the lighted window. He remembered that there, right under the window, there were several large, high, thick bushes of elder and snowball. The door from the house into the garden on the left side of the house was locked. He purposely and carefully checked it as he passed by. At last, he reached the bushes and hid behind them. He held his breath. I must wait now, he thought, till they reassure themselves in case they heard my footsteps and are listening, if only I don't cough or sneeze. He waited for about 2 minutes, but his heart was pounding terribly, and he felt at moments as if he were suffocating. No, my heart won't stop pounding, he thought. I can't wait any longer. He was standing behind a bush in the shadow. The front part of the bush was lighted from the window. Snowball berries, how red they are, he whispered, not knowing why. Quietly, with careful, noiseless steps, he approached the window and stood on tiptoe. Before him lay the whole of Fyodor Pavlovich's bedroom. It was a small room, divided all the way across by red screens. Chinese, as Fyodor Pavlovich called them, Chinese, raced through Mitya's mind. And behind the screens, Grushenka. He began examining Fyodor Pavlovich. He was wearing his new striped silk dressing gown, which Mitya had never seen on him before, tied with a tassel cord also of silk. Clean, stylish linen, a fine Dutch shirt with gold studs, peeped out from under the collar of the gown. On his wearing. All dressed up, thought Mitya. Fyodor Pavlovich stood near the window, apparently deep in thought. Suddenly, he jerked his head up, listened for a moment, and having heard nothing went over to the table, poured half a glass of cognac from a decanter and drank it. Then he heaved a deep sigh, paused again for a moment, absent-mindedly went up to the mirror on the wall between the windows, lifted the red bandage from his forehead a little with his right hand, and began to examine his scrapes and bruises, which had still not gone away. He's alone, thought Mitya. Most likely he's alone. Fyodor Pavlovitch stepped away from the mirror, suddenly turned to the window and looked out. Mitya instantly jumped back to the shadow. Maybe she's behind the screen. Maybe she's already asleep. The thought needled his heart. Fyodor Pavlovitch stepped away from the window. He was looking for her from the window, so she must not be there. Why else could she stare into the dark? So he's eaten up with impatience. Mitya at once jumped closer and began looking through the window again. The old man was now sitting at the table, obviously feeling dejected. Finally, he leaned on his elbow and put his right hand to his cheek. Mitya stared greedily. Alone, alone, he again repeated. If she were here, his face would be different. Strangely, some weird and unreasonable vexation suddenly boiled up in his heart because she was not there. Not because she's not here, Mitya reasoned and corrected himself at once, but because I have no way of knowing for certain whether she's here or not. Mitya himself later recalled that his mind at that moment was remarkably clear and took in everything to the last detail, grasped every small feature. But anguish, the anguish of ignorance and indecision, was growing in his heart with exceeding rapidity. Is she here? Finally, or is she not? Boiled angrily in his heart, and he suddenly made up his mind, reached out his hands and tapped softly on the window pane. He tapped out the signal agreed upon between the old man and Samedrikov, twice slowly, then 3 times more quickly. Tap, tap, tap. The signal meaning, Grushenka is here. The old man gave a start, jerked his head up, jumped quickly to his feet, and rushed to the window. Mitya jumped back into the shadow. Fyodor Pavlovitch opened the window and stuck his head all the way out. Grushenka, is it you? Is it you? He said in a sort of trembling half whisper. Where are you, sweetie? My little angel? Where are you? He was terribly excited. He was breathless. Alone, Mitya decided. But where are you? The old man cried again and stuck his head out even further, stuck it out to the shoulders, looking in all directions, right and left. Come here. I have a little present waiting for you. Come, I'll show you. He means the envelope with the 3,000, flashed through Mitya's mind. But where are you? At the door? I'll open at once. And the old man leaned almost all the way out the window, looking to the right in the direction of garden gate and peering into the darkness. In another second, he would surely run to open the door without waiting for any answer from Grushenka. Mitya watched from the side and did not move. The whole of the old man's profile, which he found so loathsome, the whole of his drooping Adam's apple, his hooked nose, smiling in sweet expectation, his lips, all was brightly lit from the left by the slanting light of the lamp shining from the room. Terrible, furious anger suddenly boiled up in Mitya's heart. There he was, his rival, his tormentor, the tormentor of his life. It was a surge of that same decision, vengeful and furious anger of which he had spoken, as if in anticipation, to Alyosha during their conversation in the gazebo 4 days earlier, in response to Alyosha's question, How can you say you will kill father? I don't know, he said then. Maybe I won't kill him, and maybe I will. I'm afraid that his face at that moment will suddenly become hateful to me. I hate his Adam's apple, his nose, his eyes, his shameless sneer. I feel a personal loathing. I'm afraid of that. I may not be able to help myself. The personal loathing was increasing unbearably. Mitya was beside himself, and suddenly he snatched the brass pestle from his pocket. God was watching over me then, Mitya used to say afterwards. Just at that time, the sick Grigory woke up on his bed. Towards evening of that day, he had performed upon himself the famous treatment Samedrikov had described to Ivan Fyodorovich. That is, with his wife's help, he had rubbed himself all over with some secret, very strong infusion made from vodka, and had drunk the rest while his wife whispered a certain prayer over him, after which he lay down to sleep. Marfa Ignatievna also partook, and being a non-drinker, fell into a dead sleep next to her husband. But then, quite unexpectedly, Grigory suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, thought for a moment, and, though he at once felt a burning pain in the small of his back, sat up in bed. Again he thought something over, got up and dressed hurriedly. Perhaps he felt pangs of conscience for sleeping while the house was left unguarded. At such a perilous time, Samedrikov, broken by the falling sickness, lay in the next room without moving. Marfa Ignatievna did not stir. She's gone feeble, Grigory thought, glancing at her, and groaning, went out into the porch. Of course he only wanted to take a look from the porch, for he was quite unable to walk. The pain in his lower back and right leg was unbearable. But just then he remembered that he had not locked the garden gate that evening. He was a most precise and punctuous man, a man of established order and age-old habit. Limping and cringing with pain, he went down the porch steps and walked out towards the garden. Yes, indeed, the gate was wide open. Mechanically, he stepped into the garden. Perhaps he fancied something. Perhaps he heard some noise. But glancing to the left, he saw his master's window open, and the window was now empty. No one was peering out of it. Why is it open? It's not summertime, Grigory thought, and suddenly, just at that very moment, he caught a glimpse of something unusual right in front of him in the garden. About 40 paces away from him, a man seemed to be running in the darkness. Some shadow was moving very quickly. Lord, said Grigory, and forgetting himself and the pain in the small of his back, he rushed to intercept the running man. He took a shortcut, obviously knowing the garden better than the running man. The latter was heading for the bathhouse, ran behind the bathhouse, dashed for the wall. Grigory kept his eyes on him and ran, forgetting himself. He reached the fence just as the fugitive was climbing over it. Beside himself, Grigory yelled, rushed forward, and clutched his leg with both hands. Just so, his forebodings did not deceive him. He recognized the man. It was him, the monster, the parasite. Parasite? The old man shouted for all the neighborhood to hear, but that was all he had time to shout. Suddenly he fell as if struck by a thunderbolt. Mitya jumped back down into the garden and bent over the stricken man. There was a brass pestle in Mitya's hand, and he threw it mechanically into the grass. The pestle fell 2 paces away from Grigory, not in the grass, however, but on a footpath, in a most conspicuous place. For a few seconds, he examined the prostrate figure before him. The old man's head was all covered with blood. Mitya reached out his hand and began feeling it. Afterwards, he clearly recalled that at that moment he had wanted terribly to find out for certain whether he had cracked the old man's skulls or merely dazed him with the pestle. But the blood was flowing terribly, and instantly poured its hot stream over Mitya's trembling fingers. He remembered snatching from his pocket the new white handkerchief he had provided himself with for his visit to Madame Kokolokov, and putting it to the old man's head, senselessly trying to wipe the blood from his forehead and face. But the handkerchief instantly became soaked with blood as well. Lord, why am I doing this? Mitya suddenly came to his senses. If I've cracked his skull, how can I tell now? And what difference does it make? He suddenly added hopelessly, If I've killed him, I've killed him. You came a cropper, old man. Now lie there. He said aloud and suddenly dashed for the fence, jumped over it into the land, and started running. The blood-soaked handkerchief was crumpled in his right fist, and as he ran, he stuffed it into the back pocket of his coat. He was running like mad, and the few rare passers-by he met in the darkness in the streets of the town remembered afterwards how they had met a wildly running man that night. He was flying again to the house of the widow Morozov. Fenya had rushed to the head porter, Nazar Ivanovich, just after he left and began begging him, by Christ, God not to let the captain in again either today or tomorrow. Nazar Ivanovich listened and agreed, but as bad luck would have it, he went upstairs to his mistress, who had suddenly summoned him, and on his way, having met his nephew, a lad about 20 years old who had just come from the village. He told him to stay in the yard, but forgot to tell him about the captain. Mitya ran up to the gate and knocked. The lad recognized him instantly. Mitya had already tipped him several times. He had once opened the gate for him, let him in, and with a cheerful smile, courteously hastened to inform him that Agrafena Alexandrovna is not at home at the moment, sir. Where is she, Prokhor? Mitya stopped suddenly. She left about 2 hours ago with Timofey for Mokoroy. Why? Mitya cried. That I can't say, sir. To see some officer. Someone invited her there and sent horses. Mitya left him and ran like a madman for Fenya.